YouTube, it's your girl Orochi, and today I've got kind of an interesting video for you. I don't normally do long-form videos, but I had the nut on my bouzouki break 2 weekends ago when I was at a festival, and I gotta fix it, so I wanted to make a video about the process. In this video, we will go over how to remove an old nut from an instrument, how to create your own nut files with simple tools, how to craft your new nut using some other tools as well as the nut files you'll be making, and finally, how to attach the new nut to the instrument. Now, in this example, I will be using my Celtic bouzouki. There's a couple interesting things about this instrument. So the first is that it has double coursed strings, which means these strings are in groupings of 2. It's much like a 12-string guitar in that way. We do use some different strings on it, but that's not really super relevant for this video. You will be able to use this strategy for any instrument that has a plastic nut. Now, what I'm going to show you might work for a bone nut, but I haven't tried it, so I'm not going to endorse it as working for a bone nut. If you have a plastic nut, this process will absolutely work to cut a new nut, or simply cut deeper grooves in it, or, I play a lot of metal. I know you guys play a lot of metal. Sometimes you use thicker strings, and when you use thicker strings, then you need to cut the nut wider to accommodate those thicker strings. Before I get further into the video, I wanted to send a huge thanks to Rob Meldrum. Rob is a mandolin player here in the US, I believe, and he has created a setup guide for the mandolin that I will be linking in this video description. Now, in his setup guide, he goes over how to create nut files using the method that I use in this video. So this isn't a method that I came up with on my own. I just thought that because I'm going through the process of creating new nut files and filing a new nut for my instrument, that I would film it and create an instructional to help spread this information out to more people, because let's face it, it's hard to learn how to do luthier work, and the more of it you can do yourself, the faster you can get your instruments back, and the more money you can save, because this stuff takes a lot of time to do. Now, the second thanks I wanted to send is to Music Makers Instruments based out of Minnesota. They were able to hook me up with 6 bouzouki nuts fairly quickly. And, in North America, finding that sort of thing is hard. It's really, really challenging. The only other option I had was to send it to a local music store for about 3 weeks to have a custom bone nut cut. Now, it would be really nice to have a bone nut, but I can't be without this instrument for 3 weeks. So I had to make do with what I've got. So hopefully this is a great video example of how to use innovation to overcome other constraints you have in your life. Maybe you don't have enough money to buy nut files. Maybe you don't have enough time to wait for it to sit at the guitar shop or what have you. So I hope you find this video helpful. Now I'll start to get into the process. The first step that I'm going to go over is taking the nut off the instrument. I'm just going to chronicle everything in the order that I did it. So if you want to skip to any individual sections of the video, you can find links in the description that will help you get to that section, so you don't have to watch the whole video if you only want to know, hey, how can I make nut files so I can file the nut in my guitar a little bit better, or, what have you. So I want to make sure that it's easy to find those sections. These are the tools that we'll be using today. First and foremost, we've got a set of feeler gauges. Now, you might recognize these if you do a lot of work on cars. Commonly, they're used to gap spark plugs, but they've got a lot of other uses too. The main reason we've got them is a lot of these are the exact same thicknesses as the strings that we'll be putting on our instrument. So if we cut teeth into them, we can create a saw that will function as our nut file a little bit further along in the video. On that note, to be able to cut the feeler gauges, you're going to need a set of diamond files. Now, you don't need a full set of these to actually cut the nut file. You will need this one, most specifically. It's shaped like a triangle. So it's a lot easier for us to cut teeth with a file like this. Now, a flat file will work too. You could even use something like a Dremel if you've got the right tip. While I'm talking about the Dremel, I've got it around, so I'll be using it in this video in order to help speed up the process of cutting the nut, because as you can see, I've just got some blanks here. They're going to need some major adjustment to be able to fit on the instrument. So it'll make it faster for the video. If you've got a Dremel, great. Absolutely use it. It's going to make the process a lot faster. If you don't, you can use some of the flat files from your diamond file set to do the same sort of steps that I'll be doing, and you'll see me in the video use these to finish up the cuts that I'm making with the Dremel, because the Dremel isn't great at making precise files, or sand precisely. We'll also need some markers. Gotta, you know, draw out on the nut so that you know where you're supposed to cut. Tape. Sometimes we need to take two feeler gauges and put them together to get the right size, so you might need the tape in order to stick two of them together to create a proper nut file. We'll also need some things to hold the nut while we work on it. Now, I have this helping hands lying around from doing a lot of soldering work. If you've got one of these, it's likely to make it a lot easier for you. However, you can use a pliers as well. You'll notice this is kind of a weird pliers that I've got. It's actually a surgical forceps. I have some other pliers, but they're in a different spot, and these were just easier for me to grab, if I'm being honest. But these are super useful too if you've got a hollow body and you need to install the pots into it. I've got some really long curved ones that I use to install the electronics in my Ibanez hollow body, and I'd really recommend these if you're doing any work like that. They are a godsend. I don't know how I would have done that full electrical swap without them. We'll also need some more measuring tools. So these are going to be how we actually measure the instrument and measure the nut to be able to both make sure the nut is the right size for the instrument and make sure that we are cutting the slots for our strings in the right spots. We'll probably mostly use the micrometer, but you don't necessarily need to, as long as you've got a ruler that can at least get precise enough down into the millimeters. You're likely to be successful with it. I would really recommend investing in a micrometer if you do a lot of work on instruments. It is an invaluable tool to have around. You can find a lot of them dirt cheap online. You don't need to get a super fancy one. There's cheap hardware stores too that sell stuff like this. In my particular situation, I need some glue. That's just to stick the nut on the instrument after it's fully been cut. And something to take the old nut off. So you could use a pliers. You could use, not a pliers, you could use a screwdriver, you could use a knife, anything that's got a nice fine edge on it. I would recommend using a blade like this just because it's going to be easier to get it underneath the nut to pry it off without taking some of the wood with you. Now that we've got our tools set out, we're ready to get started. This is our victim, I mean patient. You can see the nut on this instrument broke off over here, so unfortunately we don't have the ability to use this string anymore. That's problematic for me. This is the instrument I use for most of my live shows, so I've got to get it up and running again so that I can actually use it. Now, normally I would recommend cutting the strings off of this and just working with it that way, but I'm going to attempt to loosen the strings and taking the nut off with the strings still on it. The main reason I'm doing that is because I put these strings on like 2 weeks ago, and I really don't want to have to use new ones. So if I fail at that, you'll see me cut the strings. If I don't fail at that, then we'll leave the strings on. Now, I didn't mention in the tools section of the video to grab a string winder. You probably have one of those lying around. If not, I guess you're just going to use your hands. So the way the nuts are usually connected, we can see it's pretty perpendicular to the neck, which is great on this instrument. I've seen some guitars where the nut is like sunken down a little bit, and that's going to make it a lot harder to remove. So in this situation, I'm going to be able to get the blade up underneath here in this gap, and I'm going to be able to start cutting. So you can see that. I've got to turn it sideways so I can get my hands on it properly, but you get the idea. Of course, be careful while you're doing this. Slow is better. Don't do anything too hard. at the end of the day, we just are trying to pry this nut free. We're not trying to, you know, dig in here or anything. Wow, this thing is destroyed. Look at that. Well, so it happens when you play in hot, humid weather. Sometimes instruments take some damage. You can see how I'm just wiggling the tip of this in here to get it underneath the nut. These usually aren't attached super well, so you don't really need to put that much effort into getting it off. As with most things, if you have to try too hard, you're probably doing it wrong. There we go. Not the cleanest work, but you can see I got the nut off. So that's great. That's exactly what we wanted. It looks like there is some glue and some other stuff left over. So I'm just gonna hit this with one of the files in order to make it a nice smooth surface for me to put the nut back on. And this is gonna be one of the areas where having a full set of files really benefits you. If you just have the triangle file I mentioned earlier, you'll notice it would still work. It would just be a little more work than what I had to do. So, you know, you can get it in there like that. It doesn't cover the full width of the nut, so you've got to get both sides and all that sort of stuff. Now I got this little stuff here that looks like I just chipped it maybe or something while I was taking the nut off. I'm not going to really worry about cleaning this up. This instrument was pretty inexpensive. It's part of the reason I use it for live shows. Getting one of these new is a little bit more expensive. This particular model of bouzouki, I've seen them used anywhere from like $300 to $400. I think the company that sells them new charges something pretty similar to that. It's actually the most affordable version of this instrument that exists, at least that I've found. They're pretty good. It intonates extremely well. And, you know, for an instrument that you're taking to live shows, I play this in like 90-degree days out in the sun and all sorts of stuff. I don't want to be taking a $1,000 instrument out to that kind of show. So there's plenty of better octave mandolins and bouzouki's, but if you just need a workhorse, this is a fantastic option for you. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox on the bouzouki, but now that we got our old nut removed, the downside is we've unfortunately broken it, so it's going to make some of our ladder steps a little bit harder, but that's fine. All right, next up, we are going to have to do some measuring to get the nut the right size for the instrument. The ones that I have are a little bit larger than the width of the neck, so we're going to have to measure the neck, and I'm going to have to file it down to size. You can see I measured it with the micrometer. We're at 34.4 millimeters. I'm going to aim for probably 35 millimeters on my cuts. That will give me a little bit of some extra space to be able to file it down to just the right size. Now, you might have a better tool to cut these. Honestly, the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to mark on them, and I'm going to take the Dremel and I'm going to file it down with the Dremel. If you've got a better method of cutting these, I would love to hear what that method is. You could probably use one of the nut files that we're going to make a little bit later in the video to do that, but I think the Dremel will just be faster, most likely. Now, the other thing we're going to need to do from a measuring perspective is we're going to have to mark off where each of these slots are on the new nut once we've got it done. Now, I obliterated the old one when I took it off the instrument, but simple problems call for simple solutions sometimes. So we've got some glue that we were going to use later. And the main reason I'm doing this is because measuring these nut slots with the micrometer is going to be a pain. So it's going to be a lot easier if I can just take this nut and I can put it next to the other nut that I'm going to cut to be able to draw where the lanes for the strings are supposed to go. So you can see we've got a mostly put together nut. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. You can see this is like a little bit lopsided. If you do break your nut and you get this far in the process and you're like, oh, well, it's glued together, I'm going to attach it to my instrument again. Don't do that. It's just going to break. The glue isn't that strong. It's not going to hold it. This next part is probably the most exciting part of the entire video. It is a unique method that I learned from Rob Meldrum in order to create inexpensive nut files for your instrument. It can be hard to locate nut files. If you do find them, they're going to be expensive. You will need specific sized nut files for each of the nut slots on each of your instruments. If you have a variety of different instruments with different string thicknesses and all sorts of stuff like that, then you might need a lot of nut files. So this is an inexpensive way to be able to create your own nut files. Now, I already have some nut files that I've created for working on my mandolins, so I wanted to show those as an example quick at the beginning here. The first one, you'll notice it has tape on it. It's actually 2 of the feeler gauges taped together, and this is to create the proper thickness for that. Now, if you look real closely at this, you can see that I cut some teeth into it. Since we're working with a plastic nut, we really just need something that is stronger than plastic in order to cut those slots for our strings. This method probably will not work for a bone nut, but I haven't tried it. I can't tell you if steel or bone is actually harder. So if anybody's used this method for a bone nut, I'd love to hear how it worked out for you. We only really need a simple tool for this one, and that is our diamond file. Now, earlier in the video, I mentioned you can also use a Dremel for this section, so you might see me pull the Dremel out in order to speed up the process. But really, we just need something that we can use to cut these teeth into the feeler gauges. So I'm going to go through my feeler gauge set, and I'm going to take it apart. We need to isolate the specific ones that we need. In my case, we need an 11, a 16, a 28, and a 40. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we're going to need to stick feeler gauges together in order to make this work. Fortunately, I found an 11, a 16, and a 28. So these will be real easy to make. The one that'll be a little bit harder is the 40, and that's because most of these feeler gauge sets only go up to 35, as you can see here. So I gotta put 2 of them together. Fortunately, I've got a 30 and I've got a 10. You can't really read the 10 on this one, but I promise you it says 10 on there. Now that we've got our feeler gauges picked out, we can start cutting our nut files. So off screen, I taped together the 30 and the 10 to create a 40. I also labeled it so I can easily figure out what size it is later. I'm actually gonna start with that one because it's going to be the most rigid and it's the hardest one to actually mess up by accident. What I've got here is called a helping hands. I have it around for soldering work and other work, but it just so happens to be really fantastic at holding things. They call it helping hands for a reason. So in general, you know, if you're working with just the file, you can just hold it. It's not really a big deal, but because I'm going to work with the Dremel a little bit later, I don't really want my hands near that while it's spinning around. We want to protect them. Another method you could use to hold it would be to use your pliers, or in my case, surgical forceps. So I'm gonna do the first cut on this one the old-fashioned way, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about with the diamond file. We've got our triangular diamond file here, and we're just gonna cut some teeth into it. So we just need to get a little bit of a bite here. And this is what our first tooth should look like. You can see we've got a little bit of a divot in there. We're gonna make somewhere between 3 and 4 of these on each of the nut files. I'm probably gonna be shooting for 4. It's mostly to make the cuts on the new nut a bit easier because I'm not simply trying to make the depth a little bit larger. I'm cutting a whole new nut for the instrument. So that went pretty well. Other than rubbing the 40 off on one side, because Sharpie comes off when you have oil on your hands, I've got a little bit of a nut file going here. You don't need to be too precise with it. You can see those teeth are just, they're whatever. They're pointy. They'll cut plastic. That's all that really matters. You should be able to feel it's a slightly sharp edge, but unless you're trying and putting force on it, you're not really going to do any damage with this nut file. You can see I can just rub my finger on it and it's totally fine. But it'll be enough to cut plastic, and that's all that matters. So I'm going to make the other 3 with the Dremel quick. It'll go a lot faster that way. If you are using a Dremel to create these, make sure that you're using a cutting or grinding wheel and that you're putting at an angle, because you want to create teeth. We're not looking to just create some flat divots. So attack it like this with the Dremel. So in this situation, you can see how much more effective the Dremel was. It got these teeth cut to a much better depth a lot quicker. But again, if you're trying to save money, you could buy nut files for the cost of a Dremel, most likely. So unless you have one sitting around, I wouldn't buy one for this. I just happen to have one. We got ourselves a set of nut files. Now, I really like the way the cuts on these 3 worked out a lot better than the ones with the diamond file. You can see that that was a lot harder for me. So I'm gonna go back and clean this up a little bit. Still not perfect, but it's better. This will be a slightly better cutting edge once we get to actually filing down our nut slots. Alright, now that we've got our nut files created, it's time to measure off our nuts to be able to create the new one for the instrument. Now, I mentioned this earlier in the video, but as was the case with Rob's name, I want to make sure that people skipping through the video still hear about this awesome group of people that helped me out in this situation, and that is Music Makers Instruments outside of Minnesota. And honestly, I couldn't find another place stateside that could get me a nut that was roughly the size I needed for my bouzouki or my octave mandolin. I even visited the local music store, which is a very large and notable music store. I'm not going to drop their name in this video, but the only way they would have been able to help me out is if I would have left my instrument with them for 3 weeks and paid them to cut the nut themselves. So you know, besides being all for saving money, I did, you know, regret not being able to take the professional choice of having a bone nut cut for it, but quite frankly, I just couldn't be without this instrument for that long. These nuts aren't going to be the exact size that we need. You'll notice that they were cut off on the edges, so the edges are a little bit rough. We're going to want to file those down regardless. It's a little bit taller than the old nut. Shouldn't even say a little bit. It's taller than the old nut by a pretty decent measure. About half the size. So we're going to need to take a lot of this off in order to be able to fit it to the instrument. Now earlier I measured how large the nut was on my instrument, and it was 35 millimeters, or at least that's where we're going to start. So I'm going to use my micrometer, which has a handy ruler built into it, to mark it off at 35 millimeters. Unfortunately, on this black nut, you can't see my mark from the Sharpie too well, but I marked it for 35 millimeters. Now, when I did the measurement, you'll remember the micrometer said 34.5, roughly. The reason I'm doing this to 35 is because the initial tool I'm cutting it with is not going to be super precise. So I want a little bit of margin of error to be able to correct it manually with the diamond file. Again, I'm going to pull out the Dremel because filing this down with the diamond file will take a very long time, but it's still something you can do if you're short on funds. I'm gonna finish cleaning up some of these edges a little bit. You notice that that's not really super flat, so we want to flatten that out a bit. And there's some burrs on this side. So again, this is why we cut it to 35 millimeters instead. Now for the moment of truth, let's see if it's 35 millimeters. 36 1/3. That's not too terrible. We've only got a little bit of distance to go. There we go, now we're at 35 millimeters. Pretty messy work. Alright, now I'm gonna clean this up a little bit. The one side's fine, but this side that I was using the Dremel on could use just a little bit of a touch-up. Don't be afraid to be a little rough with it. We only need one of these two sides to stay flat throughout the video, so at the end we will end up, you know, cutting the excess off, and I'll use that side to cut the nut slots on so that I can ensure that the side I'm sticking on the instrument is flat. The next thing we're going to need to do is see how tall the old nut was, because we want this new nut to be a similar height. We've got 6.7 millimeters. I'm going to aim for 7 again, just because it's a lot easier to draw some precise lines using round numbers. You can see my cut isn't super perfect, it's very rough, but that's fine. We're gonna fix this up using the grinding tool on the Dremel and then do some fine adjustments with the diamond file. But before we do that, let's make sure it's roughly the size we need it to be. We got 8 millimeters. Again, in this situation, because we're filing it, bigger is better than too small. If you had a parent that worked construction like me, they will frequently say the phrase, measure twice, cut once. And, you know, we don't want to throw all our work away just because we made a bit too liberal of a cut. So we're gonna get this cleaned up. Now again, this edge does not need to be perfect by any means. You can see it's kind of gobbled up, but we will clean this up a little bit later after we've cut the nut slots into it. You'll notice my cut isn't even, you know, perfectly straight. If we measure this side, we got 8 millimeters. If we measure this side, we got 8.9. So I'm gonna spend a little bit more time cleaning this side up. So this is good enough for now. You'll notice the top is still incredibly rough. That's fine. We will make this look a bit better in the next section of the video. All right, now at this point we should have a nut that is going to fit our instrument. And it's time to do a test fit before we add the finishing touches to it. Now, I'm not gonna pretend I'm perfect and got this straight on the first time around. It was too big initially, and I used the Dremel on it again off camera because, well, I don't think you guys need to watch me Dremel more stuff today. But what we wanna do is we wanna make sure that it's flush on these edges. If it's a little bit smaller, it's better than if it's a little bit longer. And the reason for that is your hands are going to be here and you don't want to scrape them up against the nut on the sides here. So you want to make sure it's properly sized. The next step in our process is going to be to round it off. You'll notice all nuts are rounded. That's just to decrease the surface area that the strings need to move through. And especially with an instrument like this with a 0 fret, the nut really doesn't matter nearly as much. You just don't want the strings to get caught up on it. All right, now that we know that our new nut fits, we're gonna go through and file some of the edges down a little bit. This is mostly just to keep it from catching on your hand when you're playing the instrument. So you'll notice you have 4 sharp corners on these edges. We're just gonna wanna file those down so that if you do come in contact with them, it's a little bit smooth. As you can see, it's just enough to remove some of those sharp corners. We don't need anything too crazy. We just don't want to cut ourselves playing our instrument. Now that we've rounded those edges off, we've got to curve the nut like this one is. So you can see on the old nut how there is a curvature to it. That is mostly just to decrease the surface area that the strings need to touch while you're playing the instrument. So the less surface area there is on the nut, the better, but we still need it to guide the strings and make sure they're in the right spots. On an instrument like a guitar that doesn't have a 0 fret, you are going to need to make sure that these are precisely cut, because just a millimeter can be the difference between abhorrent string buzz and, you know, having to press your guitar down with gorilla strength. So when we get into the nut slot cutting section, I'll detail that a little bit. We're just going to add some curvature to one side of the nut. The things to keep in mind with this as you're producing the end result is that the nut that you received from the manufacturer likely has some good cuts on it already. So you can generally tell by the grain on the plastic. So you can see that side is untouched. That side is untouched. That side is untouched. And this is the side that I've been filing away on. Now, because of this difference, the 3 edges that are untouched are going to be the best edges to be attached to the instrument. At the end of the day, we want to start our filing from this edge that we've been working on already because it's not perfect. This is going to be another place where having your Dremel is extremely helpful, because filing this with the diamond files is going to take you forever. It still will work out great, but it's just going to take a while. So be prepared to spend a lot of time doing that if you're going to do it that way. All right, so now we've got a new nut. We've got some curvature there. It's not perfect. It's not pretty. The one from the manufacturer looks a lot better, obviously, other than, you know, being glued together. by yours truly. We can see they're roughly the same size. The curvature is pretty close. I'm going to touch up this front edge just a little bit, but otherwise this one's good to go, and I'll make the next one. Now, your hands are probably insanely sore if you used one of these, but we're done with power tools if you use power tools. The next step in our process is going to be to cut the nut slots. There's two things that are very important about the nut slot. We've got to be concerned about the spacing of the strings, as well as the depth. Now again, with this being a 0 fret instrument, I don't need to be nearly as concerned about the depth. I just need the depth to be roughly equivalent with where the fretboard meets the nut. That's going to be the ideal cut for this type of nut. But if you are not working with a 0 fret instrument, you will have to be extremely precise with how deep these cuts are. I also took each of the nuts I made and I cleaned up some of the edges a little bit with the Dremel and the diamond file. I didn't bother showing that on the camera because you probably don't really need to see it. The easiest way to mark these is going to be to use our old nut as an example. So that's the main reason that I actually went through the effort of gluing this back together. If you don't have the old nut for one reason or another, you're going to need to find the ideal string spacing for the instrument, and this is going to vary immensely depending upon what instrument it is. I would encourage you to look to your manufacturer's website to see if they're able to tell you how far apart those strings are supposed to be. But in my case, it's easy. So we do have to pay attention to the direction. The curvature is going to need to go the same way. Now, I don't really want to have to start the cuts with these nut files. They don't really bite in very good until there's already a place for you to be putting the nut file in. So I'm actually going to take our trusty utility knife from earlier, and I'm going to make a slit at each section where I marked that a string should go. Now you can see I didn't make these starter cuts super deep because, well, we just need enough to be able to get these nut files to bite. The other thing is be incredibly careful cutting near your fingers. You don't want to almost cut yourself like I did. We are stringed instrument players and, you know, we need our hands. Now that we've got a starter cut done, we're going to go through and we're going to start using the nut files to cut our nut. Now again, pay special attention to the curvature of the nut. This is going to help you make sure that you don't screw up because you spent a lot of work putting these together so far, and it would be awful if you had to start over on one of them. It's also part of the reason I made two, because if I mess one of them up in this process, at least I can finish the other one and come back to making another spare nut later. We're going to start on the treble side. This is going to be the 11 nut file, and I'm just going to start filing. I'm also going to take this 11 nut file and I'm going to go across all the strings with it. I'll repeat this method with the 16 from the second set all the way to the bass set. Same for the 28 on both of these. The main reasoning for that is that it's going to be incredibly hard to get this 40 to cut properly like this. So we need a little bit of a cut to pave our way. So you'll notice when I was using the nut file earlier, I was starting the cuts with a very specific motion. It's a pulling back motion like this. If you don't do it that way, you're liable to make the cut in the wrong spot. This is part of the reason that we used the blade to start the cut, but it's still a small cut and it's really easy to get out of that channel. So you want to make sure that these cuts are nice and precise because that's going to be what makes up our string spacing later. Now, I started with the 11 on the treble side so I can make some guiding holes. And we can see I cut that one a little bit deeper, but I've still got some work to do on these other ones. So now I'm going to move to the 16, which is the next thickest. I'm not going to use it here at all. I'm only going to use it on these 3, and that's going to make a spot so that I can get the bigger files in later. On to the next thickest, which is going to be our 28. Again, we're going to only do this on the bass side, so it's going to be on the 2 sections with the wound strings on this instrument. The basic takeaway here is thin strings, use only the thinnest one. Second thinnest string, use the 2 thinnest ones. Third string, use the 3 thinnest ones, and the 4th string to use all of them. So we're going to go through and do that too. Now, while it's not perfect, you can see we've got our slots started for each of the sections that the string is supposed to come through. The hardest one of these to use is going to be this one because it is 2 different pieces of metal taped together. I'm actually going to go through and tape a little bit further up before the next section of the video so I can use it easier. After we've got these slots started, we're going to need to know how deep they need to go. So we will take our old nut and we will measure the depth of the strings. Now that we've got our slots started, we're ready to measure out how deep we want them to go. You'll notice that the fretboard is on this side of the nut, and we've got the curvature on this side of the nut. It's going to be important to keep this bearing while we do this because you don't want to make the cuts in the wrong spot. It took a lot of time to craft the nut. You can see that these aren't super deep on this side, the side by the fretboard. You can even see where the fretboard was mounted, so these are basically right up to the fretboard. But on this side, you can see that they're deeper. So that means that we want to measure on this side, but we want to cut at an angle. I'm actually going to use this one this time. It's just a little bit easier to measure these instead of using a micrometer. Again, we want to measure in millimeters. And look at that, that's pretty lucky. That's just 5 millimeters from the bottom of the nut. So we're going to measure from the bottom of this nut. It's a smidge taller than the old one, and we're going to have to mark off that 5 millimeter spot. So as you can kind of see, it's really hard to find a Sharpie that shows up on black. But in any case, I've got to get these cut all the way down to here. But again, it's going to be at an angle for the break angle of the strings. This is the most precise part about cutting this nut other than the string spacing. So we want to be incredibly meticulous as we measure this. Now, as I mentioned, with me having a 0th fret on this guitar, it makes it so that I have a little bit more leeway when I'm cutting this nut. But if you're cutting this nut for an electric guitar or an acoustic guitar or anything that doesn't have that 0 fret, you're gonna have to be extremely precise with how deep these are, because just a little bit of difference can cause the nut to be unplayable. So like I just did, you can use the backside of this nut file that you created to help clean burrs out of these. You don't want anything in here because extra friction is going to cause problems for the strings. So you can see I got those cut to depth. One of them's maybe a little bit too far, but that's fine. The fretboard will be there anyway, so I'm not super concerned about that. Actually, I'm going to cut this one even just a little bit deeper. There we go. We got the nut slot for the thinnest set of strings totally cut. It's going to take a while and some manual labor, but you know, all things that are worth doing take time. We're going to move on to the next one now. I got the 16 ready for that, but it's going to be the same deal. Alright, we got the second set of slots cut all the way down. I am going to turn the camera off and finish these last two off camera, partially to give the camera a break and partially because it's just the same process as the first two. So I'm just going to go through and get these two done, and I'll show you the finished product in a minute. Now I have completed filing down the nut slots. Full disclosure, this took me, gosh, I don't know, an hour and a half to 2 hours to cut these all the way through. Overall, including the production of the new nut files, this whole process has taken me maybe 6 to 7 hours. So just, if you're going into this project, know that it's going to take you a while to start from scratch. Filing a nut that's already crafted is going to be a lot easier, but, you know, I essentially created a nut out of a hunk of plastic. We're on to the last step, which is adding it to the instruments, which is going to be the most fun step because I get to see the realization of all my hard work. First thing we're going to do is, of course, another test fit. And this time, if you left the strings on your instrument like I did, you're going to want to put them into the actual nut slots and make sure that they fit. Awesome. We can see that the strings do indeed fit into these slots that we've cut in the nut. So that's where we want to be. The depth on the bass end looks like it could maybe use a touch-up, but once I do a full setup, I should know more for sure. Just gonna add tension to a couple of these strings. So it looks like we've got a successful test fit of our nut. Once we add tension to here, these will lock down onto the 0 fret, and we'll have a working instrument again. So that's very exciting. If you don't have any adhesive at this point, you can simply tune the instrument up and the string tension will keep this nut on. If you have adhesive, you should put it on here because it's going to help the nut stay in place a little bit better, but it's not an absolutely necessary step, so if you don't want to, you don't really have to. Now, in case we need to take this off again, we don't want a crazy amount of glue on here, just enough to get it to stick to the wood. Make sure you glue it on in the right direction. After putting this much work into something, it would be absolutely dreadful to have it not be installed correctly. Make sure you've got it nicely centered. If you're using adhesive, if you're just keeping it on with string tension, it'll be fine. And voila! We've got a new nut. It's not the prettiest, but it'll work and the instrument will be playable, which is, you know, what matters at the end of the day. I'm going to be the only one looking at this one. When people are watching me play, they're looking at a million other places. So at the end of the day, I consider this a resounding success. We've got a new bouzouki nut, and I can go back to playing this for some live shows. And that's a wrap! My instrument now has a new nut, and it's playable again. I hope you enjoyed chuckling every time I said nut in this video, because we all know that that's a funny word. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a like, a comment, or subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. These long-form content videos take a lot more time to produce than just a quick video of me playing music. And finally, I wanted to give one last thanks to Music Makers Instruments and Rob Meldrum. Neither of those individuals paid me to be mentioned in this video. They just helped me out immensely in this process, and I think that they deserve recognition for that. Lastly, stay heavy, my friends.